I came to Omaha.
I was able to identify that he had lived in Omaha, but never gave the statement that he committed the crime.
I know you can't have evidence that said I did it, because I know I didn't do that.
He washed the blood off his hands before he left. He thought he'd erased every trace. But when Jerry Watson leaned over that bathroom sink in 1978, scrubbing a dead man's blood off his fingers, he put his hand on the medicine cabinet. And he left a fingerprint on the glass. He would walk free for the next 31 years. He would move states. He would change his name. He would tell a detective to his face that there was no evidence he had done anything. He had no idea the fingerprint he'd just left was sitting in a drawer in Omaha, waiting for a machine that didn't exist yet. To understand how a fingerprint could sit in a drawer for 31 years, you have to go back to the night it was left there. October 1978, Omaha, Nebraska. Carroll Bonnet was 61 years old. He worked at Clarkson Hospital in Omaha. He lived alone in a downtown apartment. By every account, he was quiet, dependable, and private. The kind of person who went to work, came home, and asked very little from the world. He was the kind of man whose absence wasn't noticed immediately. That is how this story begins. Not with a scream. Not with a witness. Not with a body discovered in the street. It begins with a man who simply doesn't arrive at work. Carroll Bonnet failed to appear at his job at the hospital 2 days in a row. For a man that dependable, that was unusual enough to worry the people who knew him. A friend of his grew concerned and called the manager of Bonnet's apartment complex and asked him to go check on him. The manager went to the apartment and knocked. There was no answer. So he did what you do when you are worried about someone who lives alone and is not answering. He looked through the mail slot in the door. And he saw Carroll Bonnet lying face down on the floor. He could not tell from there whether the man was sick or hurt or worse. He called an ambulance. The Omaha Fire Department arrived, and when they could not get in easily, they forced the door. What they found inside ended any hope that this was a medical emergency. Carroll Bonnet was dead. He was naked, lying face down, and he had been stabbed in the abdomen. He had not collapsed from a heart attack or a fall. He had been killed. And the moment the police stepped inside, they knew this wasn't a natural death. They were looking at a crime scene. Bonnet, by every account, was a tidy man. His home was normally neat and orderly, but now it was in disarray. Furniture pushed out of place. Newspapers scattered across the floor. Tables disturbed. Signs of a struggle everywhere. This had not been quick, and it had not been quiet. Carroll Bonnet had fought for his life in that apartment. And then there was the detail that told investigators the most. The telephone cord had been cut, severed, deliberately. In 1978, there were no mobile phones. The telephone on the wall was the only way a person in that apartment could call for help. And someone had made very sure that Carroll Bonnet could not reach it. Someone had taken the time, in the middle of everything else, to cut the one lifeline that could have saved him. That is not panic. That is control. That is a person thinking clearly enough, in the middle of a killing, to close off the victim's only escape. Whoever had done this was not out of their mind. They were, in a terrible way, organized. As investigators moved through the scene, they began to catalog what was there and what was missing. Carroll Bonnet's wallet, missing. Carroll Bonnet's car, a 1964 Buick, gone from where it should have been. Present and scattered through the apartment were the ordinary leavings of the person who had done this. Cigarette butts in the wastebaskets, in the living room and the kitchen, empty beer cans. Whoever had been here hadn't rushed. At some point, they had felt comfortable enough to smoke, comfortable enough to drink. And there was one more thing, something investigators had almost never seen before and would never forget. Near Carroll Bonnet's body, the killer had left 3 towels, and on closer examination, those towels and the scene around them pointed to something even uglier than a robbery gone wrong. Investigators came to believe that Bonnet had not only been murdered, he had been degraded, humiliated, that whoever killed him had wanted to do more than end his life. They had wanted to leave him with no dignity at all. We are not going to dwell on the details of that. Carroll Bonnet was a real man, and he deserves better from this channel than to be reduced to the worst thing that was done to him. What matters is this. The person who killed him did not just want him dead. There was cruelty in it, something personal or something hateful, or both. And then, as if all of that were not enough, the killer did one final thing. Before leaving, he left a message, a note, deliberately placed for the police to find. We'll come back to what that note actually said, because it changes how you see this entire crime. But understand what it means that it existed at all. Getting away with murder wasn't enough. This was a killer who wanted to be remembered, who wanted the people chasing him to know they were being taunted. He stabbed a 61-year-old man to death, cut the phone cord, stole the wallet, took the car, humiliated the victim, then left a note daring the police to catch him. And for 30 years, they couldn't. But in 1978, he also left behind the one thing that would destroy him. He just didn't know it yet. Walking out into the Omaha night, he believed nobody could ever connect that clue to him. He was almost right. Every killer leaves something behind. Usually it is something they could not help. A hair, a drop of blood, a print they did not know they left. The man who killed Carroll Bonnet left all of those things. But he also left something else. Something he wanted the police to find. The note. Placed at the scene deliberately for investigators to discover. And when they read it, they understood what kind of person they were dealing with. The note said, and I quote, "I am leaving this crime with only one clue. Find it yourself, pig. Die, pig." And then it was signed with a single word. Helter. If that word sounds familiar, it should. Less than a decade earlier, Charles Manson had turned helter-skelter into one of the most infamous phrases in American criminal history. His followers even smeared those words in blood at the scenes of their murders. By 1978, helter-skelter had become shorthand for theatrical, senseless, cult-driven violence. And here it was, signed at the bottom of a taunting note next to the body of a murdered hospital worker in Omaha, Nebraska. One thing is important here. There is no evidence, none, that Carroll Bonnet's killer had anything to do with Charles Manson or any cult or any group at all. That connection does not exist. What we have is a killer who wanted investigators to think of Manson, who reached for the most frightening reference he could find and signed it to his crime to make himself seem like something bigger and more terrifying than he was. Remember that, because the image this man wanted to project, a mastermind, an untouchable, a figure pulled from America's darkest headlines, was a performance. The truth of who actually left that note was much smaller and, in its own way, much more ordinary. But in 1978, the police did not know that. All they had was a butchered man, a ransacked apartment, and a note daring them to catch a killer who signed himself after the Manson murders. So they did what good investigators do. They stopped looking at the theater, and they started looking at the evidence. And this killer, for all his bravado, had left a great deal of it. Start with the note itself. He said he was leaving only one clue. That was a lie. He had left clues everywhere. He had smoked in the apartment, cigarette butts sat in the wastebaskets, in the living room and in the kitchen. In 1978, you could not pull DNA from a cigarette butt. But investigators collected them anyway. They bagged them. They preserved them. Because good investigators save today's evidence for tomorrow's science. He had been drinking. Empty beer cans were left behind. Investigators collected those too. Then they put them away with everything else. And then there was the bathroom. Because after Carroll Bonnet was dead, his killer did something that tells you he was thinking about getting caught. He went into the bathroom to clean himself up, to wash the blood off his hands before he walked back out into the world. And in that bathroom, he touched things. He left prints on the medicine cabinet. He left a print on the rear side of the bathroom door. Latent fingerprints and palm prints pressed into the surfaces of that bathroom by a man who was, at that very moment, trying to erase the evidence of what he had done. The irony is impossible to miss. The most careful thing he did, washing away the blood, became the one thing that identified him. In the act of cleaning up, he signed his name to the crime. Not the fake name at the bottom of the note, his real one, in the ridges of his own fingers. He just could not be read yet. Then investigators found something even stranger. Among the evidence was a newspaper, a thrifty nickel, a local classified paper, and scribbled on one of its pages was a name. Jerry W. 2 words, a first name and an initial, written inside a murdered man's apartment. At the time, it meant nothing. Just ink on a page surrounded by far more dramatic evidence. No last name, no face, no context. Investigators logged it like everything else and moved on. That scribbled name would sit inside an evidence file for more than 30 years before anyone realized they had been looking at the killer's first name all along. So look at what this killer actually left behind. A note signed with a stolen piece of infamy, fingerprints in the bathroom pressed into the glass while he cleaned up, palm prints on the door, cigarette butts, beer cans, and a first name and an initial scrawled on a scrap of newspaper. By the standards of 1978, this was an embarrassment of evidence. This was a killer who had left investigators almost everything they could want. And here is the cruel part. It was not enough. Because in 1978, evidence was only as good as the thing you could compare it against. A fingerprint is worthless if you have no matching print on file. A name like Jerry W. is worthless if you have no way to search for every Jerry W. in the country. The killer had left his identity all over that apartment in a dozen different forms, and the police had no way to read a single one of them. The man who signed himself Helter had, without meaning to, told the truth about one thing. He really had left the clue that would catch him. He was just decades too early for anyone to find it. After the murder, the first thing the killer did was take Carroll Bonnet's car. That 1964 Buick was the first thread the police had to pull. Find the car, and you might find the man who took it. They did find it. Not in Omaha, not even in Nebraska. The car turned up in Illinois, more than 400 miles from the crime scene. That told investigators something important. Whoever killed Carroll Bonnet had not stayed local. He had used that stolen car to put state after state between himself and Omaha. But the car had another story to tell. When it was found, it was wearing license plates that did not belong to it. Stolen Illinois plates, reported stolen the day before Bonnet's body was even discovered. So this was not a man who panicked and fled. This was a man who had swapped the plates to avoid being traced. Careful, deliberate, methodical. The same cold planning that had cut a phone cord now showed up again on a stolen car. The Illinois police went over that Buick. They pulled what evidence they could from inside it, including more cigarette butts, and they lifted fingerprints. But here is where the case ran into the wall it would sit against for the next 30 years. Inside that car, investigators could only find 2 usable fingerprints, and when they examined them, one of the 2 belonged to Carroll Bonnet himself, the victim, which left 1 unidentified fingerprint inside the stolen car. 1 print from a man they could not name. Now, step back for a moment and look at what investigators were holding by the end of 1978. They had fingerprints from the bathroom, palm prints from the door, an unidentified fingerprint from the stolen car, cigarette butts from 2 states, beer cans, 3 towels, a taunting note signed Helter, and a first name scribbled on a newspaper, Jerry W. On paper, that is an enormous amount of evidence. It is more than many killers ever leave. Investigators did exactly what they should have done. They took those fingerprints, and they searched them. But in 1978, searching meant something very different than it does today. There was no national fingerprint database where investigators could submit a print and wait for a match. What existed were local files, state files, and that's where the search ended. Fingerprint cards sat inside filing cabinets, separated by department and by state. Most comparisons still had to be done by hand. So the police searched what they had. They compared the killer's prints against Omaha's files, against Nebraska's files. And when that produced nothing, they did more than most departments would have bothered to do. They sent fingerprint requests to agencies outside Nebraska, asking other jurisdictions to check the prints against their own records. Every search came back the same way. Nothing. No match. Anywhere. And this is the tragedy of the entire investigation. It wasn't that Jerry Watson's fingerprints didn't exist somewhere. The problem was much simpler. Even if his fingerprints were sitting in a file somewhere in America, there was no system in 1978 to search for them nationwide. If the killer's prints were sitting in a police file 2 states away, Omaha had no practical way to ever know. The evidence wasn't the problem. The technology was. It is like having a key that fits a lock in a building you cannot find, in a city you are not allowed to enter. And then there was the name. Jerry W. Think about what that meant in 1978. How many men named Jerry, with a last name beginning with W, were living in America? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. You can't build a murder case on a name that vague. You cannot knock on that many doors. Without something more, Jerry W. wasn't a lead. It was just 2 words. On a scrap of newspaper. One by one, every lead ran out. The car pointed them toward Illinois, and then nothing. The fingerprints held a name, but no way to find it. Jerry W. hinted at an identity, but no way to prove it. The note promised 1 clue, yet it solved nothing. The detectives who worked this case in 1978 were not lazy, and they were not incompetent. They collected the evidence. They preserved it. They chased the car across state lines. They searched every file available to them and reached out to others. They did their jobs. They were simply born into the wrong era. By the end of 1978, everything they needed to solve Carroll Bonnet's murder was already sitting inside evidence bags and on fingerprint cards. The killer had a name. He had a face. He had 10 fingers that had left their marks all over that apartment. The only thing missing was the machine that could finally read them. So the case went cold. The evidence went into storage. Carroll Bonnet's murder became another name on America's growing list of cold cases. Not closed, just forgotten. Sitting in evidence rooms, year after year, waiting for someone or something to finally look again. For the man who signed himself Helter, this was the best possible outcome. He had driven east, changed the plates, dumped the car, and vanished. No one had come for him. No one even knew his name. As far as he was concerned, he had won. For 30 years, it looked like he had. Before we keep going, I want to tell you one thing about this channel. Everything you hear on this channel is built from real sources: court records, police reports, trial transcripts, no invented dialogue, no filler to stretch the runtime. If that's the kind of true crime you've been looking for, I'd love to have you subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel, and it means you'll be here when we uncover the next case together. Now, let's go back to Omaha. There is something strange about a cold case. For everyone connected to it, time keeps moving. But for the case itself, time stops. The evidence never changes. The fingerprints on that medicine cabinet in 1978 looked exactly the same in 1988 and in 1998 and in 2008. It sat inside an evidence room in Omaha, on a fingerprint card, inside a paper envelope, in a drawer, completely unchanged while the world kept moving without it. And the world kept moving. Think about everything that happened in the 30 years after Carroll Bonnet was murdered. Presidents came and went. The Cold War ended. The internet was invented and put a screen in every home. Phones went from being things bolted to a wall, the kind of phone whose cord got cut in that apartment, to computers people carried in their pockets. Through all of it, in a quiet evidence room in Nebraska, one set of fingerprints simply waited. Meanwhile, the man who left them kept living his life. That's the part of a cold case people rarely think about. While the evidence sits frozen, the person who left it is out there, free, getting older, getting away with it. Every year the case stands still is another year the killer wakes up, eats breakfast, goes to work, goes home, and isn't caught. Jerry Watson didn't spend the next 3 decades hiding from the world. He lived an ordinary life. He moved around. And crucially, at some point, he stopped being the person the Omaha police were looking for because he stopped using his own name. He lived in Missouri, he lived in Florida, and he lived under names that were not his, aliases. A man erasing his own trail, not with a dramatic disappearance, but with the slow, ordinary work of just becoming someone else. New state, new name. No connection to a murder in Omaha that, as far as anyone could tell, was never going to be solved anyway. For 30 years, it worked. Perfectly. But those weren't the only 30 years passing. While Jerry Watson was moving from state to state and shedding names, the science of catching people was quietly, relentlessly getting better. In 1978, remember, there was no way to search a fingerprint across the entire country. The best investigators could do was compare it, by hand, against the files they happened to have. But for years, people had been working towards something better, a single national system. One place where a fingerprint recovered from a crime scene in Nebraska could be compared automatically against millions of fingerprint records from across the United States, not by hand over weeks or months, by computer in hours. For a long time, that was only an idea. The technology simply wasn't ready. Computers weren't powerful enough. The databases weren't connected. The machine the detectives in Omaha needed still didn't exist. Then, in 1999, it finally did. The FBI called it the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS. It changed everything. For the first time, investigators could search a latent fingerprint against millions of records from across the country through a single national system. A comparison that once could have taken weeks, or never happened at all, could now be completed in hours. Now stop for a second and think about what that meant. The fingerprints sitting inside that evidence drawer in Omaha hadn't changed. Not even a little. For 21 years, it had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. The fingerprint wasn't any better than it had been in 1978. The detectives weren't suddenly smarter. The evidence hadn't become stronger. The only thing that had changed was the machine that could finally read it. But cold cases don't solve themselves. A machine can only search the evidence someone chooses to give it. Somebody still had to remember Carroll Bonnet. Somebody had to walk into that evidence room, pull the old file off the shelf, take out a fingerprint card that had been sitting there for decades, and decide it was worth trying one more time. That almost didn't happen. Even after IAFIS became operational in 1999, Carroll Bonnet's fingerprint remained exactly where it had always been. Inside that drawer, waiting. For nearly another decade, the technology capable of identifying the killer already existed. The fingerprint capable of naming him already existed. They were finally living in the same world. But they still hadn't met. Because that's another cruel reality of cold cases. The evidence waits patiently. People don't always know it's waiting. By 2008, Carroll Bonnet had been dead for 30 years. His killer was older, living under different names, believing the past had finally let him go. 3 decades had passed since anyone had been able to move the investigation forward in any meaningful way. To almost everyone, the murder had become history. An old file, another unsolved case, one more name on a list that kept growing. Jerry Watson had every reason to believe he was safe. More than safe. Forgotten. He believed the fingerprint in Omaha no longer mattered. He believed 30 years had buried the truth. He believed history was on his side. He was wrong. Because somewhere inside the Omaha Police Department, someone was finally about to open that drawer. 30 years after Carroll Bonnet was murdered, someone asked about the case. It was 2008. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a deathbed tip. It began the way many cold cases do. Someone asked a question about an old file, and that question landed on the desk of someone who knew exactly what to do with it. Her name was Laura Casey. She was a senior crime laboratory technician with the Omaha Police Department. And in my opinion, she's the person who solved this case. Not with a confession. Not with a dramatic arrest. With patience, expertise, and a database. When Laura Casey opened the file on Carroll Bonnet, she saw something the original detectives had never truly been able to use. Fingerprints. The latent prints lifted from the bathroom in 1978, the ones pressed into the medicine cabinet and the bathroom door while the killer washed the blood from his hands. For 3 decades, those fingerprints had been waiting. Not because the evidence was weak, because the technology hadn't caught up. This wasn't 1978 anymore. Now there was IAFIS. So Laura Casey did something no one had done in more than 30 years. She took the fingerprints lifted from Carroll Bonnet's apartment and ran them through the system. And that changed everything. Think about what had happened. For 30 years, investigators had been staring at the answer without any way to read it. Now, in less than 5 hours, the machine gave them one. Less than 5 hours. After 3 decades, the fingerprint that had sat untouched through the end of the Cold War, through the birth of the Internet, through the rise of mobile phones, suddenly produced a list of possible matches before the day was over. But this is where television often gets it wrong. A computer doesn't solve a murder. It doesn't flash the killer's name across the screen. It gives investigators a place to begin. From there, the real work still belongs to people. Laura Casey didn't stop when IAFIS returned its candidates. She spent days examining them, ridge by ridge, whorl by whorl, Comparing every tiny detail from the fingerprints recovered inside Carroll Bonnet's bathroom with the prints the system had identified, because this wasn't about finding someone who looked close enough. It had to be exact. A fingerprint match isn't an educated guess. It isn't a probability. It has to be something you can defend confidently in a courtroom. So she checked, then checked again. And when she was finished, Laura Casey had a name. A real name. Not Helter. Not the theatrical signature the killer had chosen to leave behind. His real name, Jerry Watson. And the moment that name appeared, another piece of evidence suddenly came back to life. For more than 30 years, investigators had been holding a newspaper with 2 words scribbled across one of its pages. Jerry W. For decades, it had meant almost nothing. A first name, an initial, no face, no full name, no way to search it. Now the fingerprint had done what the detectives never could. It filled in the missing letters. Jerry W. Jerry Watson. For 30 years, the killer's first name had been sitting inside the evidence file, waiting for the fingerprint to tell investigators who he really was. The clues hadn't changed. Only their meaning had. So investigators began looking into Jerry Watson. And almost immediately, the pieces started falling into place. Watson had grown up in Cicero, Illinois. That mattered, because Carroll Bonnet's stolen Buick had been recovered in Illinois. Not just in the same state, near the community where Jerry Watson had grown up. The stolen car hadn't simply disappeared. In many ways, it had gone home. Then investigators uncovered something even more significant. Around the time Carroll Bonnet was murdered in 1978, Jerry Watson had been visiting a relative in Omaha. That relative lived only a short distance from Carroll Bonnet's apartment. Now the evidence began fitting together with almost unsettling precision. A man whose fingerprints were inside the victim's bathroom. A man whose first name had been scribbled onto a newspaper inside the apartment. A man who was in Omaha when the murder happened. A man whose hometown was near where the victim's stolen car was eventually abandoned. 30 years earlier, those facts had been scattered across different pieces of evidence. Now they pointed in the same direction. Toward one man. Jerry Watson. The investigation had spent 3 decades looking for a suspect. Now investigators were trying to catch him before he disappeared again. And then they discovered something almost unbelievable. Jerry Watson wasn't hiding. He wasn't living under another name somewhere investigators couldn't reach. They knew exactly where he was. He was already in prison. Not for murder. For burglary and drug offenses. After escaping justice for more than 30 years, Jerry Watson had eventually landed behind bars. For completely different crimes. But there was one problem. He wasn't going to stay there. His release date was approaching. Suddenly, time mattered again. For 30 years, investigators had all the time in the world. Now they had almost none. If they didn't move quickly, the man whose fingerprints had finally identified him would soon walk out of prison. A free man. They didn't have another 30 years. They had weeks. If you're still watching, thank you. It tells me you enjoy true crime that's built on evidence instead of speculation. So before the detective and Jerry Watson finally come face to face, let me ask you something. After everything you've heard so far, the note, the fingerprints, 30 years of a man walking free, do you think he ever really believed he would be caught? Tell me in the comments. And while you're there, let me know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this one, please subscribe. It genuinely means a lot. Now, let's get back to Omaha. On December 2nd, 2009, Detective Doug Heraut of the Omaha Police Department boarded a plane. By then, the case had officially been reopened and assigned to Heraut, a cold case detective. Laura Casey had given him the name. Heraut had built the case around it. The Illinois childhood. The relative in Omaha. The stolen car abandoned near where Watson grew up. He had a fingerprint match. He had the scribbled name that finally made sense. He had a suspect. But there was still one thing he didn't have. Jerry Watson's DNA. So Heraut flew to Illinois, to the prison where Watson was being held, to collect it. And to do something else. To sit across the table from the man he believed had murdered Carroll Bonnet 31 years earlier and look him in the eye. Now put yourself in Jerry Watson's position for a moment, because it explains everything that happened next. As far as Watson knew, he was untouchable. The murder was more than 3 decades old. He had never been charged. He had lived under different names in different states. He had signed the crime with a fake name designed to point investigators anywhere but toward him. In his mind, there was no possible way anyone could connect him to a dead man in an Omaha apartment after 31 years. He had gotten away with it for longer than some people live. Why would that change now? So when Doug Heraut sat down and started asking about Carroll Bonnet, Jerry Watson didn't crack. He didn't confess. He denied everything. He denied knowing Carroll Bonnet. He denied ever being inside the apartment. He denied any involvement in the murder. As far as Watson was concerned, this detective from Omaha had nothing. He was fishing. And then Jerry Watson said the one sentence that defines this entire case. He looked directly at Detective Heraut and said, and I quote, "I know that you can't have evidence that said I did it, you know, 'cause I know I didn't. I know that you can't have evidence. Not just the arrogance, the certainty." Jerry Watson believed every word of it. Because from his point of view, he had done everything right. He had cut the phone cord. He had stolen the wallet. He had taken the car. He had switched the license plates. He had driven to another state. He had washed the blood from his hands. He had signed a fake name. And for 31 years, it had worked. What Jerry Watson didn't know, what he couldn't have known, sitting in that interview room so certain of himself, was that the most careful thing he had ever done was the very thing that had already convicted him. When he leaned over that bathroom sink to wash away Carroll Bonnet's blood, he left his fingerprints on the medicine cabinet. Those fingerprints didn't disappear. They didn't fade. They didn't stop existing. They simply waited. Waiting inside an evidence drawer in Omaha for 31 years until the world finally built a machine capable of reading them. And that machine had already found him. That was why Doug Heraut was sitting across from him. Jerry Watson was telling a detective there couldn't possibly be any evidence at the exact moment that evidence had already put a name to his crime. In a strange way, he wasn't lying to Detective Heraut. He was lying to himself. He had told himself the same story for more than 30 years. That he had gotten away with murder. Eventually, he believed it. And that belief made him confident. That confidence made him careless. Careless enough to challenge the one detective who already knew exactly who he was. Doug Heraut didn't need a confession. He had come for something Jerry Watson couldn't explain away. Before leaving Illinois, Heraut obtained an order to collect Jerry Watson's DNA, along with a fresh set of fingerprints. And palm prints. Watson could deny the murder all he wanted. His own body was about to answer the question for him. Back in Omaha, the evidence from 1978 had been preserved. Not just the fingerprints. Physical evidence from the crime scene. Evidence that could now be tested using a technology that hadn't existed when Carroll Bonnet was murdered. DNA. Samples from the 1978 crime scene were compared with the DNA collected from Jerry Watson inside that Illinois prison. It matched. Now the case wasn't resting on one pillar. It was resting on two. The two strongest forms of forensic evidence available. His fingerprints inside the bathroom. His DNA at the crime scene. The same man who had looked a detective in the eye and insisted that no such evidence could possibly exist. The fingerprint found him. The DNA confirmed him. And the words, Jerry W., had been sitting inside the evidence file all along, waiting for someone to understand them. Every precaution Jerry Watson had taken had failed. The fake name meant nothing beside his real fingerprints. The stolen car pointed investigators toward the place he called home. The false identities didn't matter. Science didn't care what he called himself. It cared about his fingerprints. His DNA, the parts of him that had never changed since 1978. The man who signed himself Helter, who wanted investigators to believe they were hunting a criminal mastermind, turned out to be something far more ordinary. A man who was caught by his own hands. Literally. There was only one thing left to do. Take the fingerprints, the DNA, the note, the stolen car, the history, and place it all before a jury. 33 years after Carroll Bonnet was murdered, Jerry Watson was finally going to stand trial. Someone was finally going to answer for a crime almost everyone else had forgotten. On November 15, 2010, Jerry Watson was formally charged with the murder of Carroll Bonnet. First-degree murder. And use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony. 32 years after a quiet hospital worker was stabbed to death inside his own apartment, the state of Nebraska finally accused the man it believed had done it. The trial began in August of 2011 in Douglas County. It wasn't short. For 10 days, jurors listened as investigators rebuilt a murder that had happened more than 3 decades earlier. Think about what that meant. 33 years. That isn't just a long time. It's long enough for memories to fade, for witnesses to disappear, for investigators to retire, for some of the people who first walked into Carroll Bonnet's apartment in 1978 to no longer be alive. Chief Deputy County Attorney Brenda Beadle and the prosecution faced a challenge few prosecutors ever do. They had to prove a murder that had happened a generation earlier. Many of the people connected to the original investigation had died. Others couldn't be found. Some simply couldn't remember details from the 1970s with any certainty. Ironically, the very thing that had protected Jerry Watson for more than 30 years became part of his defense. His argument was simple. Too much time had passed. The delay, he argued, made a fair trial impossible. Witnesses who might have helped him were gone. Memories had faded. The case, he claimed, was simply too old to answer. But the prosecution wasn't asking the jury to rely on memory. It was asking them to trust something that doesn't forget. The evidence. Because that's what this entire story has really been about. People forget. Evidence doesn't. A fingerprint doesn't become less accurate because decades pass. DNA doesn't lose its identity with age. The fingerprint lifted from the bathroom medicine cabinet in 1978 was exactly the same fingerprint presented to that jury in 2011. The difference wasn't the evidence. It was finally understanding what the evidence had been saying all along. The jurors heard it piece by piece. The fingerprint inside the bathroom matched to Jerry Watson. The DNA from the crime scene matched to Jerry Watson. The stolen Buick, recovered near the place where Jerry Watson had grown up. His presence in Omaha when Carroll Bonnet was killed. The words, Jerry W., written inside the apartment, and the interview with Detective Doug Herout, where Jerry Watson insisted there couldn't possibly be evidence against him. By then, the evidence had already answered him. On August 25, 2011, the jury reached its decision. Guilty. On first-degree murder. Guilty. On use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony. 33 years after Carroll Bonnet lost his life, the fingerprints finally had a verdict. Then came the sentencing, and with it, one final twist that almost feels impossible. Jerry Watson was sentenced on October 17, 2011. October 17th. Exactly 33 years to the day after Carroll Bonnet's body was discovered inside his apartment. Think about that. 33 years. To the day. The clock that began when an apartment manager looked through a mail slot and saw a man lying motionless on the floor finally stopped on the very same date, with Jerry Watson being sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. Life imprisonment for murder, plus 10 to 20 years for the weapon charge. By then, Jerry Watson was a man in his 50s. He was being sentenced for a murder he committed at 19 years old. And maybe that's the final illusion this case strips away. The man who signed himself Helter, the man who wanted investigators to imagine some untouchable criminal mastermind, was 19. A teenager. A 19-year-old who murdered a 61-year-old man. Then spent more than 3 decades convincing himself he had gotten away with it. He wasn't a criminal genius. He was a young man who committed a terrible crime, benefited from the limits of his time, and eventually met a kind of science that didn't exist when he thought he had erased every trace. Jerry Watson refused to accept the verdict. He appealed, all the way to the Nebraska Supreme Court. He argued once again that the passage of more than 3 decades had denied him a fair trial, that missing witnesses had damaged his defense, that the evidence wasn't enough. He also claimed the prosecution had crossed the line during trial. The Nebraska Supreme Court reviewed every argument, then upheld the conviction. The justices agreed there was more than enough evidence to support the verdict. They acknowledged one improper remark made during the trial, but ruled it hadn't deprived Jerry Watson of a fair proceeding. The conviction stood. Jerry Watson remained exactly where he was. Prison. For life. Then, 1 year later, came the quiet ending this story deserved. In 2012, the FBI presented its Latent Hit of the Year award, an award recognizing extraordinary cases solved through fingerprint identification. That year, it went to Omaha, to Detective Doug Herout, and to the crime laboratory technician who had taken a fingerprint that sat unread for more than 30 years, run it through a machine that didn't exist when the murder happened, then spent days proving the match beyond any doubt. Laura Casey, the woman who finally read the clue, the killer believed no one ever would. There is a version of this story where Jerry Watson wins. For more than 30 years, that was the only version anyone knew. He killed a man, taunted the police, drove away, and disappeared behind new names in new states. Every lead went cold. The people who worked the case grew older. Some retired. Some died. And by every ordinary measure of how the world works, Jerry Watson had gotten away with murder. But the thing that defeated him wasn't luck. It wasn't a witness who suddenly remembered something. It wasn't a confession. It was patience. The patience of evidence. A fingerprint doesn't get tired. It doesn't forget. It doesn't move away. It doesn't change its name. The fingerprint Jerry Watson left on that bathroom medicine cabinet in 1978 simply waited. It waited while he built another life. It waited while technology caught up. It waited for the world to build a machine capable of reading what it had been saying all along. And when that day finally came, it spoke. That is what this case leaves behind. Not that Jerry Watson was a criminal mastermind. He wasn't. He was a 19-year-old who got lucky for a very long time. And not that justice always arrives quickly, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes justice waits inside an evidence drawer for decades until someone decides to open it. Some truths survive longer than the people trying to hide them. But this story was never really about Jerry Watson. He wanted it to be. He signed the note. He chose the name Helter. He wanted investigators to remember him. Instead, this is Carroll Bonnet's story. A 61-year-old hospital employee. An unassuming man who lived alone in Omaha. A man who opened his door one night in 1978 to someone he had no reason to fear and never lived to see justice. For more than 30 years, his name became a cold case, an evidence file, another unsolved homicide. But Carroll Bonnet was never just a case number. He was a person. And in the end, when he could no longer speak for himself, the evidence spoke for him. It gave investigators a name. It gave a jury the truth. And it made sure the man who took his life didn't get to keep his freedom. Carroll Bonnet waited a very long time for justice. But he got it. If this case stayed with you, please subscribe. I cover these stories the same way every time. Carefully, from the real records, one at a time. Thank you for watching The Front Page Crime. I'll see you in the next one.